Welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Chris Mikowski, and joining me today from the great state of Oklahoma is Dr. Jennifer Murray. Jen, how are you today?
I'm well, Chris. Thank you for inviting me onto your podcast today.
It is a delight to have you with us. So welcome. This is your first time with us, so thanks for spending some time with us today.
Yeah.
Now, you're in Oklahoma now, but you're coming north here pretty soon. Big exciting news for you. Do you want to share the news with our listeners?
Yeah, thank you for that and opportunity to share the news, which is now public news. I'm the newly appointed director of the George Tyler Moore Center for the Study of the Civil War at Shepherd University, and I will be finishing the semester out here at Oklahoma State, and I start the new job on June the 1st.
Wow. So big transition. Oklahoma's been very good to you, but a really neat opportunity to kind of throw yourself fully into a program that's got a great Civil War reputation. What was it that attracted you to come up to Shepherd?
Yeah, I've been at Oklahoma State for 7 years now, and I will say that I've thoroughly enjoyed teaching at OSU. I've kind of always wanted to teach at a big Research One institution and have the opportunity to work with graduate students. And our program here at Oklahoma State has both an MA and a PhD trajectory. So I've been able to sit on thesis and dissertation committees during my time here. And I really enjoyed the students here. I mean, Oklahoma State students are really exceptional in a lot of ways. And I've got to teach a lot of classes relative to American military history and the Civil War. So it was a good place for me for the last 7 years to be sort of intellectually. And I know we'll have time, Chris, you mentioned to chat about my Meade book, but having the institutional support of a place like Oklahoma State to do a big research project has been, I mean, it's been imperative. It's been priceless. But as maybe some of your listeners know, I'm from Maryland and I cut my teeth in the Civil War community at Gettysburg. I interned there as an undergraduate many, many years ago now, many misty mornings ago, and ended up working for the National Park Service seasonally for 9 summers at Gettysburg, and sort of unexpectedly fell into this career as a Civil War historian through my experience in public history. And my parents are from, I grew up in Western Maryland. My mom and dad are still there. Michael, my husband, is from Carlisle, and for us, that's an area that's it's home, but it's also, those battlefield landscapes like Gettysburg or like Antietam are so intrinsically linked to my personal and professional life that the opportunity to live and work among places like Antietam or Harper's Ferry or the scads of Virginia battlefields is just so special. And I'm very excited to have that opportunity looming on the horizon for me beginning in June.
Yeah. Now, let me ask you, what was your Civil War origin? What got you hooked on those battlefields in the first place?
It was the internship, actually. I went to Frostburg State because I grew up outside of Frostburg. So for me, it was my kind of home school. I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do with a history degree. As an undergraduate, I majored in history and political science. I thought really hard about going to law school, actually. And then a friend of mine interned at Gettysburg, and she came back from that internship experience, and we were taking the Civil War class together fall semester of what would have been my junior year at Frostburg State University. And she was just raving about the experience. And I thought, well, I'm going to do an internship. I need it for the degree anyway. I'll apply. And I really had no special interest in the Civil War whatsoever. I liked the 20th century history much better. In some ways, I still do. So I went to Gettysburg knowing very little about the Civil War. I was, 19 years old, and I spent that summer, the May to August, doing interpretation on the battlefield. The first interpretive program I did was a tour of the Soldiers National Cemetery. And then by the end of the summer, I was ready to do a tour of Pickett's Charge, the third day program. And I just fell in love with it. It was not expected in the slightest. And being on the landscape, being at Gettysburg, meeting thousands and tens of thousands of people from all across the country, all across the world, coming to those hallowed grounds and having the opportunity to share what was becoming a new interest and new passion for me with these visitors was absolutely priceless. It truly was transformative. And then subsequently, the ability to go back as I finished my bachelor's degree, I got my master's degree from James Madison, and I worked seasonally at Gettysburg the whole way through my PhD at Auburn. And 9 years every summer being in Gettysburg shaped my career in a way that I couldn't have otherwise imagined. So, and you know this, Chris, and you talk with plenty of people. I think a lot of people in our profession have these really early origin stories about falling in love with the Civil War, as a kid. And that wasn't me whatsoever. I came to it very late and completely unexpectedly. And man, I couldn't ask for a better career. And I've been very lucky and very fortunate as a Civil War historian to have the life and share these stories with people as I do.
Yeah. Now, do you have a particular place at Gettysburg that especially speaks to you?
That's a good question. When I worked there, it kind of changed every summer. There was always like a new program maybe I was working on, and I kind of got really immersed in that. But two places are kind of always been consistently my favorite. Um, One is the peach orchard, and I like standing out on the peach orchard because it's the one place on the battlefield where you can see the entirety of the Union line. Right? You can look south and you can see the round tops. You can trace the spine of Cemetery Ridge. And on a good, crisp day, you can look and see the observation tower on Culp's Hill. So I think you get a really nice spatial trajectory of that fishhook line standing in the peach orchard. And then you look to your west and you can see Seminary Ridge, and you can really understand how Sickles' forward movement changed the trajectory of the fighting on July the 2nd. And I would say unauthorized forward movement. Let me add that. Uh, since we'll be talking about Meade. But what a wonderful place to do interpretation. The story of the peach orchard, that critical ground on July the 2nd. So that was a favorite place. And then another kind of consistent favorite place has always been Culp's Hill. It's so unfortunate, and so much of our popular memory about Gettysburg is tied to Little Round Top and the Killer Angels and Shara's work and the movie Gettysburg and Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, and all for good reasons, right? This big attention to the left of the Union line. In Culp's Hill, the story as interesting, right, as important to saving the Union position, so often overshadowed. And I really like the story of the 137th New York and some of the regiments and the leadership decisions up there, George Sears Green and the like. So that was always a favorite place for me to do interpretation and kind of highlight the importance of that terrain on all 3 days of the battle, not just one, but all 3 days. That ground figures so prominently in the trajectory of the battle at Gettysburg.
Yeah. You've done a really neat book that sort of talks about the history of the battlefield and how it's sort of become the Gettysburg that we know. And to me, that's just a fascinating story. Probably, in some ways, more fascinating than the story of the battle to me. What got you into that portion of Gettysburg's history?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. Um, Auburn University, and this is true no doubt for a lot of PhD programs, we have a similar class here at Oklahoma State that's a research seminar, and it's intended to basically be a springboard to your dissertation. So I was taking that class one of the summers I was working at Gettysburg, and I was thinking about a topic that I could write on to fulfill the requirements of that class. And I ended up sort of stumbling into the period of the 1930s, the transition period between the War Department and the National Park Service stewardship. And I wrote basically a 1933 to 1938, my research paper, which essentially ended up becoming one of the chapters in the book. And when I was working in the park archives, and this is back in the mid 2000s, actually, this is probably 2006, 2007, I found just a treasure trove. Gettysburg National Military Park archives houses the institutional records for that site. So if you want to do research on the GBMA, the Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association, the War Department stewardship, and then, of course, the National Park Service, those records are housed downstairs in the visitor center. So I would go down there and just kind of roam through these collections and look at finding aids. And I was blown away by the sheer volume of administrative records housed there at Gettysburg. And then, of course, working there as I had for several years by now, I was obviously very familiar with the historiography of the Battle of Gettysburg. There are tens of thousands of books literally written on those 3 days in the campaign, but few scholars have looked at the history of the battlefield, the last 160 years of that landscape's history. So, as it turned out, then I submitted that paper for my research seminar, brainstormed with my dissertation director, Dr. Ken No, and we just decided, you have a topic here.
So we're talking with Jennifer Murray. We've had some technical difficulties, so if you're watching the video, you'll see just sort of a little glitch here. But she was just talking about her excellent book about the history of the Gettysburg battlefield on a great battlefield and how the origin of this book came about. And she took her idea to her advisor, Dr. Ken No, who many of us know from his excellent weather book. And so, Jen, you went to Ken with this idea. What did he think?
Yeah, thank you. And feeding that transition back up to where we were earlier on this conversation. So it became pretty apparent to both of us, my advisor, Ken No, and myself, that there was more than a summer research paper there. So that ended up evolving into my dissertation, which was a study of the National Park Service stewardship at Gettysburg from 1933 until 2010 is when I graduated and ended my dissertation. And the book covers the story through the sesquicentennial. And then maybe this was captured in our earlier effort at this. The last edition that came out last summer with Tennessee Press moves the book forward to 2023. So I was happy to write that new material with a lot of the changes that have been happening at the battlefield in the last decade after the sesquicentennial. So, I'd said this last time, but and no doubt your listeners are aware of this because they are guilty of this in a good way, of course. But Gettysburg is a battle that is the most it's saturated. Tens of thousands of books and magazine articles and research projects have been produced on this, mostly focusing on, of course, the battle and the campaign itself. But the history of the battlefield has been relatively understudied. There's been some good works in the field of Civil War memories. So my book makes an important contribution in that way, that it gives us a sense of how the battlefield has been preserved and developed, how it's changed over time. If you were to drop yourself in Gettysburg, let's say during World War II, you visit there in 1943, what would you have been seeing? What would that visitor experience have been like? How the battlefield was interpreted? What did that look like in the 1960s, for instance? So my book looks at those kind of changes over time questions on arguably our nation's most cherished Civil War landscape.
And people go there and they want to know about the battle, and sometimes forget that the battlefield itself has a story. And so, as you told that story, was there something in particular that you really liked, or a bit of interpretation or development that you thought like this was just a great innovation?
Yeah, I thank you for that question. What really struck me, and I'm an academically trained historian, so we are always thinking about context. And what really struck me was how much events going on at the national level, state level, but certainly the national level, influenced management issues at Gettysburg. So Gettysburg and the history of that park and its development, preservation, interpretation never occurred in a vacuum. So when we get, let's say, to the Civil War centennial and all the eyes turn to Gettysburg, President Kennedy visits there in early of 1963. CBS, every major news outlet is covering what's going to happen at Gettysburg for the 100th anniversary. Simultaneous to that, of course, is the civil rights movement. So to think about the events that are happening in Gettysburg in a really like granular level, but then also as a historian to be able to get some elevation and get some context to it really provides some layers and some nuance to that.
Mhm.
Um, and the same is true in the 1930s. You know, that was sort of my early introduction to this topic, as I mentioned, with that research paper. All right, the Great Depression, you know, I know all this kind of background as a history student about FDR and the New Deal and these alphabet agencies. But the interesting contrast, and many of your listeners know this, but the Great Depression was a really booming time for management at Gettysburg. That the battlefield hosted civilian conservation corps camps, for instance, or got money from New Deal projects like the WPA. So at the same time that America's unemployment rates top 30% in the 1930s, there's a tremendous amount of work being done at Gettysburg and really lays the modern infrastructure of that battlefield. So the roads, the comfort stations, the restrooms, all those things that we still use today see their origins in the 1930s. The modern park infrastructure goes back to the Great Depression. And that was
And,
interesting.
and and I see today the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, has hired some beavers to stop up the stream down there. No, I don't want to get into that, folks. Folks will lose their mind because I've mentioned the beavers, of course. If you just stopped with on a great battlefield, that's already, I think, a significant contribution to the Gettysburg historiography. But you've got a new book coming out this summer that I think also has the opportunity to really move scholarship forward in an important and significant way about the battle and the battlefield. And that's your upcoming biography of George Gordon Meade. How is it that you got hooked on Meade?
Well, I will say, and I wish the Meade book was coming out this summer. And just as a sort of a note to listeners, I'm writing and almost done with the Meade book, so a little bit
Oh,
longer.
see, and I was literally just looking on Amazon, and it was telling me June. It's in
Yeah,
Amazon, you lying liar that lies. Okay, so you're finishing it up.
yeah. I'm actually working on the reconstruction material right now. So I'm in 1868 with Meade.
Okay.
Um, but you know, your bigger question was how I became interested in Meade, and that's and you might have this experience too. Like whenever you write a book, and this is my Gettysburg book was my first one, and it's out and it's well received, and then the immediate follow up question is, you know, what are you going to do next? Right? It's like you just produced this album, and someone wants to know what's coming next. What do I do after the White Album? You know, like what's next? And I wasn't really sure what I wanted to work on. I had some ideas, but nothing was really, you know, nothing was really it. And it made good sense. And actually, I think this kind of came to me walking around the Gettysburg battlefield one summer, to do something that was sort of a continuation, I guess I would say, of my interest and my passion for the Battle of Gettysburg. And working there for 9 summers as I had, people would come to the battlefield with all various levels of knowledge, and very few were really Meade enthusiasts back then. That's changed a little bit, but that was, you know, the victor at Gettysburg seems so neglected in our public memory of the battle and of the Civil War, and that's certainly true in the scholarship. So when I started to read a little bit more about Meade, I found that the standard comprehensive biography of George Meade was done in the 1960s. It's a book by Freeman Cleaves, and it's really nicely done. It's got a ton of good detail in it, but certainly antiquated for us in, you know, the 21st century. So I decided, with sort of this foray into historiography, my own passions for the Battle of Gettysburg, to do something on Meade. And I wanted it to be, and this this is like this is the ambition of this project. I wanted it to be Meade from life to death.
Oh,
So what I've been working on for years now is exactly that. You know, it's certainly a focus on his command of the Army of the Potomac, his role in the Army of the Potomac, the Civil War years, but I'm tracing Meade's story through his life, life to death, and wow, I mean that has been a Herculean project to say the least. But the end is slowly, I see this tiny glimmer on the horizon. Oh,
I really like Meade. He's someone I have grown to really respect and admire. Um, in some ways, I feel like he's the Rodney Dangerfield of the Union War effort
yeah,
because he gets no respect because he gets
yeah,
overshadowed. But like,
yeah.
he's a fantastic commander.
Yeah, and since I've been working on this, and I speak to Civil War roundtables pretty frequently, and meet with all variety of nice cross section of Civil War enthusiasts and students of the war, and I say to them, we're sort of in this like Meade Renaissance, and in part, Kent Masterson Brown's excellent book on Meade at Gettysburg helps elevate that conversation. John Selby, who's retired history professor from Roanoke College, has a good book on Meade and his command of the Army of the Potomac. So there's more work being done on Meade. He's certainly talked about more than he was 10 years ago when I was sort of in the origins of this project. But, at the end of the day, Meade commands the Army of the Potomac longer than any other of its commanders. And he's in the American Civil War from beginning to end with the Army of the Potomac, except for like 100 and some days when he's on leave or is recovering from a wound. He participates in all of the major campaigns in the Eastern Theater with the Army of the Potomac, and he rightly deserves the scholarly attention. So if I can put him in conversation with people and give him a fair, objective analysis of his contributions in the Civil War and to preservation of the Union, then I will have done good work and good work for George Meade.
As you know, I'm here in Fredericksburg. So on one end of the story we have here, I've got Meade breaking through against Stonewall Jackson's men at Fredericksburg. And then
Yeah,
the other end, I've got him being overshadowed by Ulysses S. Grant at Spotsylvania. And that's
yeah.
a remarkable transformation over 18 months in a career of a guy who fights his way up to earn command of this army. He fights his way up to the respect of his peers. Um, Tell me your perception of him as you've gotten to know him during that early phase of the war, where he's really kind of cutting his teeth and earning his stripes and working his way up.
Well, I think that in part Meade is kind of a mercurial character because what we know about him really centers around his actions at Gettysburg and the follow up of the pursuit of Lee's army to the Potomac River. And one of the often cited canards is that Meade did not pursue, which is absolutely not the case. Absolutely not the case. So we get this vision of Meade in sort of our collective consciousness that he is lethargic, he's not aggressive, he doesn't have like that bold persona that Grant is going to instill come 1864. And if you look at Meade's entire Civil War career, and this has been fascinating for me to really get into this, Meade is an incredibly aggressive commander at multiple levels of command. And you mentioned, Chris, you mentioned Fredericksburg. That is Meade's aggressive leadership on display in December of 1862, right? I mean, I think we all would agree that his breakthrough is kind of like the shining moment of the Union war effort. He smashes a gap of a couple hundred yards wide in the Confederate line, Jackson's line, and isn't able to exploit that. Doesn't have the reinforcements to break through. And if you roll back from Fredericksburg, look at the Maryland campaign, for instance, in 1862, just several months earlier, Meade is an incredibly successful commander in the South Mountain campaign and on the battlefield at Antietam. And roll back from that when he's brigade commander in the Pennsylvania Reserves, really his baptism of fire in the spring and summer of 1862. On the peninsula, he's again leading at the front. And one thing, what I've tried to do with this biography is narrate Meade's Civil War career as he experienced it. Right. So his letters obviously are the backbone, to my research project. But what I've really been like keen on is looking at how the soldiers view Meade. So I wanted to get as many soldier accounts as I could of what Meade was like as a brigade commander with the Pennsylvania Reserves, or when he's Fifth Corps commander. What are the guys saying about Meade as a Fifth Corps commander? And prior to Gettysburg, the consistent dominant theme of Meade's leadership is audacity. And it's demonstrated, as I said, at multiple levels of command. So for me, that was like a through line. And I think when the book is on the shelf, I think people will be surprised at Meade's aggressiveness in all these places in all these other campaigns, and he demonstrates it consistently.
I think about that moment in the fall of 63 where he writes and says like, I'd rather be leading my division in battle than be in charge of the army right now because he understands the political frustrations of his position. And he comes to command sort of at this really weird moment where things are falling apart with Joe Hooker. There's a lot of dissent among the corps commanders. None of them want to be the next guy. Lincoln's still figuring out what to do. And so like he's called to command and I think because he's just such a consummate professional he answers that call, but he suddenly discovers like really what a hard spot that is to be in.
Right. And that moment in I agree with you completely. And that moment in June, June 28th, when sort of the proverbial knock at the door comes, when he's at his headquarters early that morning, just outside of Frederick, and he's put in command of the Army of the Potomac. And and I argue, and I say this when I talk to roundtable groups, and I'm pretty versed. I'm an American military historian with a specialization in the Civil War. I can't think of a comparable moment that the change of command was so momentous. And it was a deliberate change of command. I don't mean like Robert E. Lee takes over after Johnston is wounded on the peninsula. It's not that kind of transition of command. Think of the imperative of the moment that the Confederate Army is crossed over onto Union soil. There's real fears about Harrisburg or DC, Baltimore, Philly being threatened by the Confederate Army, and Lincoln is changing horses. That's a tremendously important moment in the Army of the Potomac. And if you think this is June of 1863, this is their third commander just that calendar year. This is their third commander just in that year. So think of the sort of the magnitude, the burden, if you will, that's placed on Meade's shoulders. And that's why I think the Gettysburg campaign and the pursuit, obviously, is his shining moment. I mean, he manages that army exceptionally well through the 3 days fight at Gettysburg, and he delivers the Army of the Potomac its signature victory.
And rises to that occasion. You talk about kind of his shining moment. I always look at the Mine Run campaign where he refuses to throw his men into battle and sacrifice lives needlessly. And he writes one of my favorite pieces of Civil War correspondence where he writes to his wife and says, "They're probably going to fire me, but I don't want to needlessly sacrifice my men."
Yeah.
And to me, that again sort of demonstrates like what a fine commander he is, and sort of understanding not only the strategic position and the stakes involved, but what it's also like to kind of be on the ground. Uh,
Yeah, and the criticisms of what Meade does in the summer of 1863, not attacking the Confederates who were dug in right around Hagerstown, around Falling Waters, and we have a similar situation at Mine Run, which not universally, but pretty close to universally, he's applauded for, shows maybe how the kind of the culture or the thinking of the army and
mhm.
the futility of frontal assaults has changed in that period of time. And we'll see it again in the Overland campaign, right? I mean, you mentioned his
Oh, yeah.
relationship with Grant. That's going to be that defines the Overland campaign and Meade's place within it.
Now, I also think about that fall of 63 where he's not just fighting against Robert E. Lee, but he's fighting a rearguard action against Dan Sickles and the Joint Committee.
Yeah,
What,
yeah.
what's your take on that? I mean, with friends like that, who needs enemies?
For sure. Fiasco. Yeah. And that actually the when you mentioned about what kind of got me into Meade, one of the first Meade books I read is Bill Hyde edits the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War testimony. And the book is called what's it called? Union Generals Speak. I think it's published by LSU Press. That was one of the first things I picked up on Meade. And I got immediately hooked on the Joint Committee and this fiasco, as it were, that played out for several months. And you're right. I mean, the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War. This is fall of 1863, and then it trickles over to really January, February, and a couple days in March of 1864. Is an effort to basically smear Meade's reputation and his success at Gettysburg, led by some radical Republicans who want to elevate or re elevate, I guess, Hooker and get him installed back into the Army of the Potomac. But to do that, you have to denigrate Meade's reputation. And it's another thing where I think about like parallels. Where do you see in American military history a general who wins a battle in a campaign being called before Congress to testify
Mm.
about that success? And what a cast of characters that are brought forth to Congress, from Dan Sickles to Abner Doubleday, David Bell Birney, all these known, Alfred Pleasanton. I mean, there's a whole lineup of them, critics of Meade. And a read on that, listeners, y'all, if you have not read through the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War, the Gettysburg Campaign, it is quite good, and it certainly impacts how Meade's reputation is viewed in the American public, as word of this and then the Historicus letter is all kind of culminating and getting out into the media in the winter of 63 and 64. And what's interesting to me about that, Meade is actually in Washington, D.C. to have a conversation with the Lincoln administration about the reorganization of the Army of the Potomac. And this is early March 1864. And Meade doesn't know a whole lot about what they're talking about in Congress. And he's walking around the streets of DC and he hears this like murmur about this upheaval in Congress and the Army of the Potomac and Meade's being investigated. It's like, what's going on? So his first testimony actually on the Joint Committee is completely unprepared. He is in DC for something else, reorganization of the army, and then he goes and he testifies with no notes, none of his orders in hand, to rebuke all these claims that have been thrown upon him and his leadership. He subsequently testifies with three more times with all his orders and more preparation. But it's interesting to me that first time is completely off the cuff. And there he is defending his reputation against these detractors, with a whole lot of politics woven in.
Uh, and I think he gets poor advice from Halleck during that period too, where he's like, "Should I say something?" And Halleck's like, "No, no, don't get in. Basically, don't get in a pissing match with Sickles because Sickles knows how to manipulate the press. You don't want to kind of go to battle against Sickles in the battle for
Yeah.
public opinion." And I think that serves me pretty poorly ultimately because he does find himself kind of unprepared when he has to go forward.
Yeah. Yeah. Meade's relationship with Halleck is volatile at best, as which isn't unusual, right? As other Civil War commanders were. But Meade is a voracious reader of newspapers, and he very much is aware of what's being said and written about him and how it's being consumed by the public. And this is something that he will obsess over in the entirety of his career. He does it in Mexico, and he does it the whole way through his tenure of Reconstruction, which is why he has that brilliant line after the surrender at Appomattox, where he says that he has basically no respect for history because he sees how it's distorted and maligned for the reputations of those who write it.
Yeah. Tell me your take on his relationship with Grant, because when Grant shows up, he has that conversation with Meade. Meade offers his resignation on the spot, and that, of according to Grant, convinces Grant to leave him in command.
Yeah.
But they have a very interesting dynamic as that command relationship evolves. What's your take on the relationship?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the Grant and Meade relationship is it's the cornerstone of the second half of my book. It's inescapable. How can you write about Meade without really understanding the nuance of the relationship with Grant? And I'm glad you mentioned that meeting in mid-March of 1864. Meade certainly expects that Grant is going to replace him, someone from the West, maybe someone like Sherman. So he's expecting that to happen. And it doesn't. So whatever happened in that meeting, Meade made a good enough impression on Grant and vice versa that they are going to form this partnership that will ultimately subjugate the Army of Northern Virginia. What's interesting about that relationship is it's certainly fraught with problems, but it's successful. That's a successful partnership. And what one of the very kind of simple points that shaped my thinking on this is something John Hennessy has an article in one of the volumes that Gary Gallagher edited on the wilderness, and Hennessy writes about the state of the Army of the Potomac at the beginning of the Overland Campaign, and he basically posits and he says, think of anyone else, high-ranking officer in the Army of the Potomac, who would submit as productively to Grant as Meade did. And could
Yeah.
you imagine Burnside or McClellan, Hooker being as productive in that secondary role as Meade was? So, what I found looking at the Overland Campaign and the Petersburg Campaign, though, and this will be very evident in my book, is that Meade has a lot more autonomy over the Army of the Potomac than we're led to believe, or we think. Meade has a tremendous amount of control at a tactical level and an operational level, and is involved in all the campaign, Army of the Potomac, through Virginia, through the surrender of Petersburg. He has a lot of autonomy over his army. And one thing I'll say yet on that question, Chris, is I cut my teeth in Civil War history as a student of Gettysburg, the student of the Battle of Gettysburg. And I kind of snapshot the Army of the Potomac in my mind to what it looked like in the summer of 1863. And that army is not even a close proximity to the army that's fighting in Petersburg or the army in the Overland Campaign. And if you look at the high command in the Army of the Potomac, let's say at Petersburg, it is very different than the army that Meade took command of. And that means working now with people like Horatio Wright or John Parke, probably one of the lesser known Union Corps commanders in history, or a volatile relationship, of course, with someone like Gouverneur K. Warren. So that high command dynamic, for Meade, he's in this like middle management, with Grant above him, and then these kind of factious and sometimes mercurial subordinates underneath him, and he has to figure out how to manage up, and he has to figure out how to kind of manage down, and that's been a really fun equation in my book.
So I can't wait to read it. And it seems to me, my take on that is that he struggles with that learning curve at first and sort of gets his arm around it, but it's never an easy task for him. And then anytime I read something, it's like, oh, well, here's an instance where he and Grant are kind of maybe getting on each other's nerves a little bit more. But oh, wait, here's an instance where, gosh, they seem to be syncing up pretty well, too. So, I mean, it's really kind of a fascinating. I can't wait to read your take on it.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good way to describe it. It's never static.
Yeah.
Never.
So now the last thing I'll ask you about Meat here before we shift gears is, and I think maybe how I kind of came to really like the guy, is reading his correspondence, the life and letters of George Gordon Meade. And I started with the edited version, but I know there's an unedited version, a little harder to get. Um, but he really opens himself up to his wife in ways that really give us a lot of insight into an army commander
Yeah.
in ways we don't get to see other characters. What do you think about that correspondence?
It's brilliant. It's my most treasured, precious primary resource. And you hit the nail on the head exactly, Chris. His wife, Margaret Meade, is his closest confidant. And when you think about like Meade's friends, we were talking about the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War. He doesn't have a lot of really close friends in the Army of the Potomac. Someone like Hancock, of course, Theodore Lyman, the aide that joins from Boston, that joins Meade's headquarters in the fall of '63, will become that in the Army, a close, intimate confidant. But really, it's Margaret. And you see him unveiling his most intimate emotions to her, the griping about Grant, the problems he has with the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War. And for me as a historian, that's the perfect window into, it's as close as we will get into understanding what Meade is thinking at a particular moment in time. And her letters don't survive, but you can infer from what Meade writes back some things about her thinking on matters. First, and this is to the Grant equation, she is not a fan of Ulysses S. Grant whatsoever because she doesn't like how Grant is overshadowing her husband. But that collection is absolutely essential to understanding Meade and his intimate private world.
I can't wait for the book. I'm just super excited about it. So,
Thank you for saying that.
yeah. So we've been talking a lot about Gettysburg, but you're going to have the chance to spend a lot of time at Antietam coming up because of your new position. I do want to talk about that just a little bit. Um, Anything particular that really stands out for you about Antietam as a story, as a battlefield, any place that draws you?
Well, so I have to imagine that if people, I think this is true. Antietam is probably one of people's top three favorite battlefields.
Hmm.
Um, I think that's probably a fair
I
assessment.
think that's a fair assessment. Yeah.
We'll see what the feedback and the comments are. Um, because of how well preserved it is. Unlike Gettysburg, which is a beautifully preserved 6,000 acres, but you have the tourism and all the commercialism trappings that surround it. But Antietam is not. It's a battlefield that is like captured in time. So you can immerse yourself on that landscape in the fall of 1862 and understand the bloodiest day of our nation's history with a healthy amount of accuracy to what the terrain and what that area looked like, 160 years ago. So for me, and I'm a Marylander, as I think we talked about. I grew up in Frostburg, Maryland, so about 2 hours to Antietam. It's a wonderful opportunity, and maybe from your own academic career that academics don't end up always at places that match so perfectly with their personal and professional interests. But for me, the job at Shepherd is exactly that. So to be able to be literally across the river, right, from the Antietam battlefield is something I'm very much looking forward to. And it'll be a neat opportunity for me to integrate my Meade work in that way. We talked about Meade's audacity at lower levels of command, and you see that in September of 1862. His fighting at the South Mountain Campaign and then certainly at the Battle of Antietam is extraordinarily important to the maturation of his command, even rising to temporarily command the First Corps after Joe Hooker's wounded. So I'm looking forward to be able to be immersed in those landscapes, and then because they wed so perfectly with my research, to have that opportunity starting in June.
Now you'll be following in the footsteps of James Broomall, who I'll give a shout out here because he was one of the very earliest contributors to ECW back in the day. Um, Obviously, just a fantastic program with the George Moore Center there. What are you looking forward to as you step into that role, and where do you want to take that program?
Yeah, Jim Broomall is a good friend of mine. I've known Jim for a long time. We have a lot of common interests, and it's he has left the center in such a healthy place. Jim, of course, is at University of Richmond now, doing wonderful things down there, and he has left the Civil War Center in such a good place. He has done such important, dynamic public programming in his tenure there that I absolutely aim to continue. I've always found myself maybe a little bit of an odd academic because I'm so rooted in public history and I'm very public facing. So to have the opportunity to put together a seminar, for instance, and we will have a seminar this fall that focuses on the Battle of Antietam. It's September 18th, 19th, and 20th. So to be able to sit down and plan a seminar and line up the speakers and think about meaningful and dynamic programming that will elevate conversations about Antietam to our audiences is just wonderful.
Yeah.
I've always been on the other side of that, the person at the Civil War Roundtable, or I've been at CWI. I've been a faculty member at Civil War Institute at Gettysburg College for 14 straight years. I started there in 2011 um, when Dr. Pete Carmichael took over that position. So to be able to take all those various aspects of my career that I've deliberately built myself in that way and harness them, and now have the platform that I'll have at the George Tyler Moore Center is truly special. I could not be more thrilled with this opportunity.
Yeah. To me, it's exciting to have you coming in here and bringing all these things that you bring and your public history background and marquee battlefield. I mean, it seems like a perfect storm of awesomeness to me.
Oh, thank you for saying that. Yeah, I like that. Perfect storm of awesomeness. I like that, Chris. That's great.
And you will be the eye of the
I'll be the
storm.
eye of the
Yeah,
storm.
yeah,
Yeah,
very good.
the eye
Very
of the
good.
tornado.
Yeah. So lots going on between now and when you head up in this direction in June. Any final thoughts for what you need to get packed up and ready to go?
Well, as you say, we're in week 8, I think, here at Oklahoma State, so almost at the midpoint of the semester. I'm glad to have the opportunity to finish up here. As I said, Oklahoma State's been a wonderful intellectual home for me. It's been a good place for me to be at this point in my career. But I'm certainly looking forward to all the opportunities that the position at Shepherd has. And if I can maybe just make a plug again for
Yeah.
our seminar, if listeners jump on the George Tyler Moore Civil War Center Facebook page or find us on Google, Civil War Center at Shepherd, the George Tyler Moore Civil War Center. Click the event tab and you'll see information there about the Antietam Conference. It's the 18th to the 20th. You'll see familiar names on the lineup. Kevin Pollak will be there. He's obviously a good friend of the emerging Civil War. Dennis Fry, Gary Edelman, Tom Clemens, Scott Hartwig, Dana Schoaf, Melissa Wynn, and Zach Fry. It's like the greatest hits, it's all-star studded cast of Antietam and Civil War. So if you're interested, think about attending that. We would love to see some new people, some new folks, and get involved in the center's activities.
Fantastic. Now, before we wrap up, I've got to ask one question. For folks who are watching on video, they may see your Bruce Springsteen collection behind you. Very impressive. We talked about this before we started recording, but I'm sure there are viewers who are like, Bruce Springsteen, what's the connection?
Thanks for asking that, Chris. Yeah. So I love classic rock music. You might see some Beatles stuff on the other side. I'm a big Paul McCartney fan. I've seen him, I think, 10 times in concert. Love Elton John. I've seen him a bunch of times in concert. And sort of consistently throughout my life, I have despised Bruce Springsteen. Absolutely, passionately have disliked him. And then some good friends of mine from Syracuse, New York said, let's go see him in concert. And he was playing in Tulsa in 2023. And they said, we'll fly out and we'll go see him. And I said, okay, I only have to drive like an hour and a half. That's good. And sure enough, what everybody says is true. If you see him in concert, you will become a super fan. A super fan. His energy in his mid 70s, plays for over 3 hours, the engagement with the audience. It's it's an experience unlike any of the other concerts I've been to. And I've seen some very, very good concerts. And since then, I've listened to him some more. Chris, we talked about this, just reading his lyrics, very much a lyricist, in the Bob Dylan kind of tradition. And I've come to appreciate him in a way I don't think I would have, at like
Yeah.
19 years old. I'm into a lot of other stuff. So my transition has been from passionate disdain to super fan in the course of one concert, and I, I never would have imagined that happening like 2, 3 years ago. That's bananas, but my goodness, yeah. And we saw him last year. He was in Europe. We flew to Ireland, and we saw him in Cork, and we saw him in Dublin at
Oh,
Croke Stadium, and it was insane, absolutely insane.
you have the zeal of the newly converted. That's fantastic.
That's the worst kind, and it's like, yeah, like proselytizing. You have that zeal's a good word, the rabid fandom.
Uh,
Yeah.
Well, Jen, what a delight to chat with you today and share your good news. We're really looking forward to what you've got coming up at Shepherd. And if there's anything we can do at Emerging Civil War to help you and your students out, please don't hesitate to call on us.
I appreciate that. Thank you for having me. I look forward to working with you in Emergent Civil War more in the future, and thanks for inviting me on this podcast, Chris. This was a great opportunity to chat with you.
It's my privilege, my privilege. I'm Chris Bukowski for the Emerging Civil War podcast. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.